Today is November 5th lecture. Not sure when you're watching it, but I hope you're watching it sometime on the 5th or maybe even early on the 6th. You do have a participation assigned today, so be sure to go online and check that out. That is going to be due on Tuesday the 6th at midnight, as per our usual schedule. We will be having class on Wednesday, November 7th, so be sure to be here. I hope that this introduction to clinical psychology gives you what you need to get started and get oriented to the topic that we're going to be talking about this next basically 2 weeks. A few of the housekeeping things that I want to take care of today on this Monday. The first one being your Exam 4 results. Well, we'll be talking about your Unit 4 quiz when we get together on Wednesday. I don't really want to post the information here. One, because I'm recording this before the quiz, so I can't really report on anything. But also, even if I did have those numbers, I'd want to be there to be able to answer your questions about them. The next item of housekeeping is signing up for your final. I've been noticing by a show of hands over the last couple weeks that people are really getting this done, and that's going to be invaluable for your success and your comfort come the end of term. The last thing that I want to mention on our housekeeping are our research options. We already had research option 2 due a couple weeks ago. Option 3 is due this Wednesday at 11 a.m. So please make sure that those of you who are doing research option 3, you make that submission deadline. Remember that your paper must be formatted in rich text, and you also need to include PDF copies of the articles you're going to be citing or using for your research summaries. The last research option due date is option 1. Credits are due. You must participate by November 14th. It's okay if it's not showing in your credit listing by the 14th. As long as it shows pending, we'll be fine. And then you also have your summary due on November 28th. Now that would be the Wednesday after we get back from Thanksgiving. So we give you a nice 2 weeks to get that summary written and everything submitted. Of course, we'll see each other on Wednesday, so if you have any more questions, we can talk then. Moving on to our new content, today we're going to be introducing the clinical aspects of psychology, and we're going to specifically be talking about anxiety disorder. When we get together on Wednesday, we'll talk about bipolar disorder, and we may even have some time to talk about schizophrenia. But on Wednesday, if not for sure, we'll get to it the following Monday. We're only going to talk about these 3 disorders specifically, one because they're the more intriguing or enticing ones. They're the ones that students typically have the most questions about. So we're going to talk about those. I also kind of need to limit it because there are so many disorders out there. I really try to pigeonhole and cover the ones that will allow us to talk about the most dynamic symptoms, the most novel or aggressive treatments, and then also the most fantastical symptoms. When we watch our videos of the individual with bipolar disorder and the individual with schizophrenia, I'm hoping that it will really solidify for you the intensity and the sincerity of these disorders. Oftentimes when we think about people with mental health issues, we think of a poor constitution, or we think of somebody who is not as strong in their convictions, or maybe even people that are weak or suggestible, and that is definitely not the case. One of the things that I want to be sure that a point that I want to be sure to get across to you guys before we start talking about clinical psychology is that we really are talking about mental health issues and not diseases of personality, and not, issues with how the people were being raised. While personality and environment early in life do impact the evolution of disease and disorder, these people truly have what could be easily described and empirically supported as a disease or a mental health issue. I mean, we see biological changes with most of these, especially the ones that we're going to be talking about. So remember that as we move through and talk about that. The other thing that I want to be sure to let you guys know is that as unfortunate as mental health issues are throughout our families, I think it's very important that we maintain some distance while we're having these conversations for the safety's sake of all persons involved. For the people who have loved ones who suffer from these disorders, I think it's important to keep our comments, not necessarily to ourselves, but truly be thoughtful about our comments and the questions that we're asking, because I guarantee you there are students in our classroom that have loved ones with these disorders. If not, they themselves have these disorders. So it's very important to me that we maintain a safe and respectful environment while we have these conversations. So We're not going to be using any derogatory terms like crazy or lunatic or whatever it is that you might be thinking of. We really are going to be talking about mental health disease and disorder. These are our chapters. Chapters 15 and 16 are the ones that we'll be talking about, and this is our Unit 5. Now, in addition to setting the boundaries about filtering our comments and making sure that we're asking helpful and nurturing questions, another very important thing to me, especially on this first day of clinical psychology, is that we set the pace, tone, understanding, however it is that you want to call it, of what abnormal is. Now, I abhor the term abnormal. I think that it is a mischaracterization. I think to say that any one thing is normative, is destructive, and potentially harmful to others. I truly believe that when we talk about what is abnormal, we are short-sighting and again making this more of a personality issue or an environmental circumstances issues rather than the mental health issue that it is. So I actually prefer to not talk about or use the terminology abnormal. I'm going to be talking about disease and disorder throughout our time together. Now, if I were to give you a few scenarios and I were to say, is this normal or is this abnormal? And you were to give your assessment on whether it's normal or abnormal. So I'm going to give you a few, for examples. The first one being, if you were to hear voices, and these voices were to, if these voices were to be informing you about the future or about potential spiritual or maybe even economic ramifications, if you were to hear these voices and almost become possessed by another entity, do you think that that would be normal or abnormal? Think about that for a minute. Why do you think that that would be, if you did identify it as being abnormal, why do you think it would be abnormal? What criteria are you basing that abnormality on? So when you think about this, classifying this behavior that you might see or you might even experience yourself and make a decision as whether or not you want to call it or abnormal or normal, ask yourself this. Or consider this. Maybe not ask yourself this, but consider this. In the Tibetan culture, one of the most revered and blessed and holy opportunities is to be possessed and to be given the insight of the future of spiritual events, economic events, environmental events, and is considered a true and sincere blessing to be touched by the Spirit. And I have yet to find a video of people having this experience. But it has been explained to me quite frequently that monks, especially in the upper echelon or the hierarchy of Tibetan culture, do end up experiencing these possessions. And for them, it is considered it's a blessing. And so one of the things that we run into when we talk about abnormality is our own expectations. And what are these expectations based on? And I think when we go through and we talk about what we call the 3 Ds, that might help us shed light on identifying something as really being abnormal versus something that might be just, I don't know, different from our culture, or maybe even a challenge to our own expectations. Our first D that we're going to talk about is deviance, and of course that's the most enticing one. This is the one that most of us think about when we think about disorder. We think about individuals participating in behaviors that are different or that deviate from what our expectations are. So what are we deviant from? Well, we are deviant from these behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that are considered normal in a specific place and time and by specific people. Now, I haven't read the most important or highlightable aspects of this definition or this concept. What we need to first look at is, who are the people who are the people that are considering this behavior? Now, if you think about yourself and your own culture and what you've been exposed to, maybe if you grew up in the South around maybe some evangelical Baptists, you might have seen people become possessed and speak in tongues. And in that instance, by specific people and in that specific place and time, that behavior is pretty normative. And in fact, it's considered something pretty special. And so when we talk about deviance, we have to understand and look at where these behaviors are happening, to whom are they happening, and what are the expectations of the people around them. Now, that being said, when we think about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM as our textbook uses the acronym and everybody else breaks it down that way, that is pretty much written by, no offense, no surprise, old white dudes, right? No, not really. Not really just old white dudes. There's a lot of genders and very varied racial and ethnic backgrounds. However, it's written by the American Psychiatric Association. And so much of what is identified in that book and structured and basically labeled as deviant is based upon our culture and what the majority of our culture identifies as being okay. And so there is an alternative, and it is authored by psychologists throughout Europe, and it's called the IRI, and it takes into different cultural considerations. And so what we might actually list as a disorder in the DSM is not listed as a disorder in the IRI, or at the very least it's defined differently and given less severity or a different kind of severity, or maybe even individuals would have to present with very severe and debilitating symptoms in order for it to be considered a disorder. And so when we talk about deviance, it's really important for us to ask ourselves, from what? And we have to look around us and take into consideration the context. Who are the people that are involved in this or surrounding themselves with this? Is this an appropriate place and time for this? And then, of course, is this considered normal? One of the more awkward or interesting things that we do in our society is that sometimes when some of us get nervous, we actually laugh. We laugh and we giggle a little bit. And you'll be surprised at how much that actually happens. And we do that when we get uncomfortable. And sometimes people do it when they feel fearful, but most of the time we do it when we're just pretty much uncomfortable. And so if you're at a funeral and, you know, they're going through the services and you have a funny thought and then you try really hard not to laugh, sometimes that can get built up and you laugh. And by specific people in our culture and during that place and time, laughing is not considered normal. So while deviance might be part of our puzzle, obviously deviant behavior isn't the only consideration, because if it was, we'd all be in trouble, because all of us at some point in time have done something that is considered abnormal in front of a specific people at a specific place and time. It's important again that we identify that this deviance is deviance from standardized or social norms. And we also need to make sure that we remember that the judgments and deviance also depend on specific circumstances. Now, distress. Distress is our third D. Now, these Ds, as I've been talking about, these are sort of the criterion or the expectations or the way in which we quantify or qualify mental health or mental disease and disorder. So our first one was a deviance. Our second one is distress. According to many clinical guidelines, behavior must be personally distressing before it can be labeled abnormal. And by personally distressing, we mean that we have to see some level of emotional or psychological stress from that behavior or those thought processes. Now, it's not always the case that everybody who has a mental health issue is going to have that perspective of self. Now, in order for us to be able to look at our own behavior and identify it as being distressing or upsetting, we really have to possess a certain level of cognitive complexity. Now, younger children who might be participating in distressing behavior before they develop those later cognitive developmental stages like formal operations, they might not actually acknowledge their behavior as being distressing. And so what happens is that we have this exception to the distressing rule, is that we can have distress even if it is not caused or even if that stress is not experienced by the individual in the disease or the disorder. Children are a good example. Paranoid schizophrenics and catatonic schizophrenics, and in fact most schizophrenics, have a detachment from reality where they don't identify their behavior as being something that's not okay. And so they don't experience distress. Individuals who are psychotic or antisocial or extreme narcissist also don't identify their behavior as being distressing. So sometimes that qualification of distress comes from the impact that it has on the people around that individual. So it does not always have to be that individual or internalized personal distress. It can be distress that is experienced by other people around them. Our last D is dysfunction, and we also call it maladaptive. I think maladaptive is a little bit better way to identify or categorize that, or a more appropriate term, but I also like the symmetry of having 3 Ds of distress, deviance, and dysfunction. Now, by dysfunction and being maladaptive, this abnormal behavior tends to impact daily living or daily functioning. For example, if an individual is obsessive compulsive and they have what we call chronic checking issues, where they have to check to make sure the stove is off, check to make sure the coffee pot's unplugged, check to make sure the curling iron's done, check to make sure the door is locked. While most of us might do this before we leave the house in the morning, and even maybe after we start driving away, we might ask ourselves, oh, did I undo that? Did I unplug that? Did I forget that? Some of us might do that. Individuals with an obsessive compulsive disorder do it to the point where they can't even get out of the driveway, where it might take them an additional half hour, 45 minutes, sometimes even over an hour before they can move forward with their day. And that impairs daily functioning. I mean, it significantly interferes with an individual's capacity for getting the job done and moving forward and being a responsible, productive member of society. So if you think about everything that it took for you to get moving today and get to this point where you're sitting down and you're listening to this lecture, everything that you've participated in is a daily functioning aspect. It's part of who you are and what allows you to be a responsible, productive member of society. Culture has an influence on how we decide what is dysfunction. For example, in some Asian cultures, when women reach a certain age, they're given quite a bit of social latitude to become less productive. Okay? They're given permission to actually take a break. And for some of us, we might call that retirement. For some people, it might be chronic fatigue syndrome, but in some cultures, it's not considered dysfunctional for an individual to cease, being productive in their normative daily functioning. It might be just the point, at, the age at which they reach where their children or their posterity or their caregivers are responsible for their daily functioning. So again, we see this sort of resurgence of culture as being an issue and identifying what is dysfunction. As much as we had to identify what was deviant using culture, identifying what is dysfunctional also is culturally based. Interestingly enough, dysfunction alone does not equal abnormality. We have to, when we think about our 3Ds, we really need to have all 3 present in order for us to say that this is a mental health issue, or begin to approach it saying that this is not normative. And by normative, when we look across all populations and we take an average of everybody else, or we look to the median of everybody else and we look to them and we say, for the most part, people do X, Y, and Z. For those individuals that work outside of that sort of expectation or that paradigm, this is how we identify that. You might be a little bit deviant, a little bit distressing, and a little bit dysfunctional without actually being an individual with a disorder. We can think about certain time periods of adolescence. I'm sure sometimes if you looked at my Saturday or Sunday while I was a teenager, man, I was not one to be proactive. Bed wouldn't get made for the weekend. It was very distressing to my mother, and it was very deviant from my family's expectations. So We could all probably find something that we meet all these 3Ds in, but when we're talking about disease and disorder, we're really talking about these issues being amplified or intensified to the point where we're really starting to see the impact on an individual's life. So lazy for a weekend, have a bad week, all of those things are very relative. When we talk about disease and disorder, we're talking about something that is sort of bigger than a moment. And in fact, most disorders have sort of a criterion of symptoms have to be present for a certain amount of time before the disorder is considered a disorder. So if you have a bad week where you're feeling lethargic and you don't want to get out of bed and nothing really makes you happy, and you might meet a lot of the qualities or the criterion for depression, but if that doesn't last for a certain period of time, okay, if it doesn't last for at least 2 weeks to a high degree of severity, then that's not going to be classified as a disorder. So time is also important when we're talking about abnormality. Now we have 3Ds, deviance, distress, and dysfunction. We have a 4th D, and this 4th D is danger. Because oftentimes when somebody does not have that perspective of self, where they might not be experiencing distress, chances are they might be dangerous to others. When we talk about this, we'll think about individuals who are psychotic, individuals who have antisocial personality disorder. We could also talk about borderline personality disorder. We might even talk about some schizophrenics. One of my soapbox moments this semester will be to point out that not all schizophrenics are violent. And in fact, the degree to which a schizophrenic participates in violence is, for most schizophrenics, is no greater than the average male in our society. And so when we think about the dangerousness or the volatility of somebody who is a schizophrenic, they are no more likely to be violent than the average male in our society. But we look upon that very differently, especially when it's a female, or, you know, we kind of associate that disease or that disorder with that volatility. And that is not always the case, and that is very, very important. Abnormal behavior may be dangerous to oneself or others. Behavior may be careless, okay, could be reckless. Individuals who are in the manic stage of bipolar disorder could be very, very careless and potentially, life-threatening to others. They could be hostile. Paranoid schizophrenics tend to have a very heightened response, a very proactive response to individuals, or confused. Oftentimes being confused is sort of the hallmark, and that confusion can lead to lashing out in defense where no defense is needed. Oh, sorry about that. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that this is not a common feature, and that's not why, that's probably the reasons why we don't talk about 4Ds. We only talk about 3Ds, because these 3Ds are the primary features. Danger is not a common feature, but it is a present feature. Well, we're going to move on and we're going to start talking about some disorders, but before we get to those disorders, I want you to know that you do have a participation. It's active now, or it will be active at noon. I'm not sure when you're watching this video, on November 5th, and it'll be due on November 6th at midnight. I want to make sure that you guys have that. Now, when we talk about these disorders, we're going to be also talking about some of the therapies. For me, it's counterintuitive to talk about disorders and then talk about therapies. It's really, for me, very illustrative to talk about how we treat individuals, why we talk about the disorders. So we're going to talk about some of the therapies while we're moving through and talking about these disorders, and we'll get into the specifics of those therapies, or a few of those therapies, later on during this unit, when we get into some more of the nitty-gritty on how we actually treat these disorders. But I wanted to make sure that you understand that we will be talking about some of the therapies while we're moving throughout this unit, because we're not going to be spending our time or detailing each and every therapy available. Similar to the clinical aspect or the disordered aspect, we're going to highlight and focus on those therapies that seem to be, either the most sensational or the most effective.